Shall we begin? I think usually we wait a little while, but this should be good enough. So welcome everybody. It's Monday, October 4th, and this is the monthly Q&A meeting. So our panel officers, just for introductions, Ed Darlington is our president, Christy Sanderson, our program chair, first VP, Cecil Sweeney is second VP, librarian, Chad Gilliland, Honey Plants, Janet Campbell, Secretary. I'm the Treasurer. Jolie is Youth Scholarship Chair. Annie Nowacek is the Military and Veterans Liaison. Cheryl Burkhead is our Editor. Becky Tipton is our Special Events Coordinator for classes. Joe Patrick is our Special Events Coordinator for the Fun Day. So thank you and welcome. And just to get started, let's see, I wanted to show, I'm always interested in the weather, so I'll start with that. This is the outlook for October, which I would say so far, the beginning of the month, we're starting off on the warm side. And the temperature outlook looks like it's supposed to be overall above average for us. And typically we have a 30% drop between the beginning of the month. Not a 30%, a 30 degree drop between the beginning of the month and the end of the month, but hopefully it might be warm. I know we're dry. The first screen that I showed was from the Weather Channel. This one is from a different source, and it's basically showing also that we're going to be above average, and that's the temperature outlook, at least through the middle of the month. We are kind of dry. This was the drought monitor through the end of August, and I've got another one here. This was September, and I'm not sure where it went, but it's not in here, but we're dry. I posted on the Facebook group site. So that leads me to believe, I wonder if I have the right slideshow. So I know Ed's here. I heard him speak, and I believe I saw Becky and also Cheryl Burkhead. So at least we have these folks with us. Let me see now if I can find that question. So here's our first question for the evening, just to get us started. Did not get very many, but feel free to speak up. You can put them in the chat room or unmute yourself and go from there. Let's see. Our first question, is from Michael Katzfee, and I'll go ahead and verbally read this out, and then I will show you the picture. He sent this earlier today. I saw this nice fresh propolis, but decided not to harvest it. That raised the question, when is it safe to collect after treatment? And I assume that it depends on the specific treatment used. We've all used different treatments, and I'll show you the propolis that he's got here. And so for people that may not know, this product is called Apogard. The active ingredient is thymol, and look what the bees did. They put a lot of propolis on it. So Cheryl uses a lot of thymol, so I'm going to start with Cheryl. What do you think?
I knew you were going to call on me. I would not use propolis that they have used during Apogard treatment. I usually collect it in the spring, but I would think that would have a lot of chemical in it.
And Becky, what do you think? What's your opinion?
I agree. I'm not I'm not an expert on that particularly. It just feels kind of wrong. I also collect propolis, make propolis tincture and use that. And I always collect my propolis in the spring when we do our first spring inspections. It's usually been kind of moved around the hive, and it's a lot of it times there's a big clump right at the entrance. The active ingredient in the Apogard is thymol, and that's from the plant thyme, which probably makes it pretty inoffensive. It isn't a synthetic chemical, it's a natural. And so somebody else might not agree with that and go, nope, it's just fine. It's just fine. Don't worry about it. But
I'd be worried about the concentration though, Becky, on that too.
if you were making a tincture, maybe to paint the insides of your hives,
Yeah.
it would probably be just fine. But if you're making a tincture that you're going to take yourself, I think that would be the bigger concern. So I don't know. And Mike, I don't have any answer to your question. So that's a throwing a dart. I don't know.
Yeah, well, I would have collected it. Well, I mean, collect the propolis before you start your treatments and use that instead of doing it after they've been treated. So you do get some granulars in there if they don't, so it might smell good if you like thymol. Anybody else? Ed? Oh, what did I do with it? There it is.
I'm reluctant to use anything where it's been chemically, come in contact with any chemicals. And I realize that this is a natural chemical, but still, I just find staying away from it. There's unintended consequences that we don't know or don't control. So I personally prefer to stay away from as much or any chemicals as I can. Now, that does not mean that I don't treat my hives. I do. I try to do it in different manners, but still, and there's times where I just have to resort to chemicals. Of course, this year with the surgeries, I don't have hives, so I'm kind of on the sideline this year.
Yeah, well, at any rate, that's one of the reasons why with most of these chemical treatments, we don't use honey supers on the hives, and we don't want to contaminate the honey or the wax. There's only a couple products that you can do that with. And so, you try to do your collecting of your wax and your propolis before you start your treatments. That's what I would say.
Robert, I don't know if you could tell, but I actually took that picture sitting on top of the trash can. And of course, that's where that stuff went. But I guess the question I kind of would have is, when would it be safe to collect propolis, or whatever from a hive that you've treated? I mean, that the propolis is going to be there forever unless you harvest it.
Yeah, good question. I would for sure, if you're using Kumafos, Checkmite, I wouldn't want that in anything. So I would say never after that. But your honey supers shouldn't have these chemicals on them because you wouldn't have used them with the honey supers on. So I would do it, say, at least try to collect it from your supers and not your brood box. Anybody else use anything? Having recommendations, thoughts? So it looks pretty, Mike. And I'd say I'd hate to throw it away, but I wouldn't use it for a product. If you're making a tincture, you're going to be spraying that in the back of your throat or something like that. So that's just the concern, which, this happens to be Apogard, but it's a good segue for talking about some of the other chemicals that we're still using.
I'm not even sure, Mike, who would be a good person to ask for sure. But I know that Marla Spivak and Gary Reuter were really doing a lot of propolis research, and they were using their propolis inside the hive. They were like making a tincture and then painting the insides of hives to provide extra protection for those bees. That they might have considered this question, and they might be good people to ask. Both are retired now, but they didn't flush all their knowledge when they retired, so I bet they would be good resources.
I know Judy even said that they have found Apogard in beeswax in the hive. So
Well, I mean, we find that chemical remnants in our beeswax from all of our different mite treatments.
exactly.
Sorry, what was?
It's okay, it's off.
Sorry.
Okay, well, I'll let me take care of that here in a minute, but I'll stop sharing the screen and we'll start going for questions from the chat room. And the first question I've got is, it sounds like from Joshua Henry. He said, I had a hive go queenless about a month ago. I could not find a queen for purchase, so I let them requeen themselves. I now have a queen that just started laying. Is the hive doomed, or what should I do other than feed to help them out? Jolie deals a lot with queens. What would you say, Jolie?
Sorry, the dogs were barking. Cecil says just let it go and see what happens because we don't know.
Yeah.
There's less drones this time of year, but it could be good. Yeah, if you've got brood and it looks good. Yeah.
That's the good thing you've got going for you. You've got a new queen.
Right.
Report back next spring.
Yeah.
Let's see. Emily and Zach said we have.
Let me jump in here. The other good thing is that without a queen for a while, he had a brood break. And so the mite population should have taken a dive. And so depending on what stores you have, even though it was queenless for a bit, you might be okay. But if you want to check to make sure they have enough stores so that you may have to feed them or add other resources to them, so that they have enough to get through the winter. But just because it was queenless and now you have a queen doesn't, like I say, you got to ask some other questions, go in and do an inspection.
Great, thank you. So Emily and Zach, they say we have one hive in its first year. We have 2 deep boxes and both are really heavy and seem pretty full of honey. Is that enough or do we need to feed them, and how do we know? Thanks. Well, thanks for asking. Becky, what do you say? Heavy hive. First year.
There, now I'm unmuted. What a great question. And keep asking yourself, and that kind of keep checking. You know what? Our bees every year consume different quantities of honey. And since this is your first year, I don't mean to be disparaging, but do you really know what heavy is? And so have you counted like how many full frames front and back of honey you have in there? And that might be a more accurate look at how much food you have, better rather than it's pretty heavy. If you try to feed them 2-to-1 syrup right now and they don't take it, then maybe they've got all they need. And that would be a good clue. They should take syrup for you until our daytime temperatures do not rise above about 45 or 50 degrees. Feeding them would not hurt them. And if they don't take the food, you would know they're not needing it. But it is something that you will need to check repeatedly throughout the winter, maybe every 2 to 3 weeks. Go out and kind of give them a look see and see where you think that they're at. If we have a box full of honey, a deep box, 10 frames, really full of honey, we should have enough to last our winter. Should, but sometimes not. So you just have to kind of keep checking. Last year we had such fluctuations in temperatures. I felt like our bees went through a lot of food. So yeah. Anybody else weigh in on that one?
Yeah, generally we say they need 60 pounds of food. And so if you take one frame of a deep brood box, one frame is supposed to weigh 6 pounds, and you've got 10 of them, there's your 60 pounds. That doesn't mean the whole brood box has to be completely full, but usually the upper and the lower, sounds like from your description, have good resources in there. It's really the amount of population of bees that you're going into winter with, or you're going into fall, and how healthy they are. That's going to determine how they come out on the other side. Check them once a month. Just, that's what I do, is pop mine, have a look to see where the cluster is. When it gets cold, right now when it's warm, I'm not that concerned, but I don't start checking for necessary feeding until November, but that's just me.
Thank you very much.
Leo Haynos is asking, I missed your session on feeding. Has it been posted to the website? No, it hasn't yet, but in the next 3 or 4 days, we should have that completed. Lauren's iPad. Lauren says, is now a good time for oxalic acid vapor treatment and time between treatments? Thanks. Cheryl, what do you say?
You're the oxalic acid vapor guy.
Yes, yeah. Well, as long as you're,
I do a cleanup in November. Are they asking for treatment now, and this is their only mite treatment that they've had?
Well, so basically the bees that you want to go into wintertime are hatching out now as adults, or they would have been hatching out from mid-October. And you kind of want to clean up your bees that are going to take care of those bees. So technically, it would have been better to treat earlier in September or late August. And then I just say that whether you do it 5, 6, or 7 days, when you do it once, the oxalic acid vapors, the crystals are still good for at least 48 hours. And you have a couple days in between. Mostly it's learning the biology and realizing that you have pupa that are sealed where the mites are hiding and being protected for 12.5 days. From the time that the worker larva is sealed until it hatches out is generally 12.5 days. Sometimes it can be a little quicker. Sometimes it can be slower. So 12.5 days, 3 times, 6 days apart. If you're going to do the vaporization, you want to do it that way. Anybody else?
I think we say this every time we have met, but all things mite related can be answered through Honeybee Health Coalition. And they are such a user-friendly website. It is clear, it's easy to understand, it helps you make decisions. It is put together by some very dedicated scientists. It is not, someone made a comment on one of the sites I'm on about it being, oh, it's just big pharma wanting you to treat more. And I don't read that at all when I read Honeybee Health Coalition. I think it's really, really good information. So when in doubt, that's where I go. That's what I look at. So
It's a good place for a lot of everything else except for oxalic acid vaporization
And
because
they
they took it
they
off.
oh, did they? See, I didn't know. They had not supported it as a multiple time treatment. And
Yeah.
so that is their choice. And honestly, it's because it's not FDA approved. So that would be why I'm sure that they don't, because they also don't do any of Randy Oliver's stuff that's not FDA approved. They just stick with what is an approved treatment. So
Well, it is approved actually. So the FDA is concerned with foods and with the levels, and they're saying it's okay. And it's the EPA that
oh,
handles pesticides.
yeah, I misspoke. You are exactly right. You are
But
exactly right. It isn't, it isn't, it's approved, used as a vapor. It's just not the way that we are applying it. So,
but the way when you go back and look at their site on the oxalic acid, they're only talking about dribble. They only demonstrate dribble. They don't do the vaporization part.
mm,
And if you look at the dates, it's from 2016, so it's already 5 years
mm,
old.
a little dated, little dated.
Yeah. So that's just what I've observed. There are other sources you can go find out about oxalic acid treatments if you want to, especially for vaporization. Someone says here, warm temps until mid-October and delay entrance reducers for mice, etc. for a bit, pros and cons. I'm a big proponent of entrance reducers, and I put mine on in early September. It calms the bee yard down. I have multiple hives. Um, uh, Mice really are a problem later on, and it could be out in the country, but that's what I do. Anybody else?
Yeah, I think it depends what treatment you're doing. If you're doing any of the Formic
That,
Pro or any of those, you shouldn't have entrance reducer on, I don't
yeah,
think.
Well, even
that too.
the Apogard drug.
Epigard, right,
As
yeah.
early as I treat with Apogard, you've got to leave the entrance open and ventilated. But as soon as my Apogard treatment's done, I start putting reducers on in the largest opening. That's really not going to keep mice out. However, you really need to switch over and put a mouse guard on. I don't know that mice, this year's weird. Normally we would have, I was looking at last year, we had temperatures in the 30s for lows last year at this time during Caw Valley Farm Tour. We had some mid to upper 30s for lows. We haven't had that yet, but when it turns, it's going to turn quick. And so depending on how many you got to put on, I don't know, maybe I should start, but the mice will start looking for places to come in and keep warm and dry. So normally we'd have them on by October.
Right. Yeah, because temperature is what really keeps the mice away when the bees aren't in cluster.
And you want to make sure you don't catch one in there and cage them into your hive either. So you either need to look and pop your bottom board, or you can take a tool and do a blind sweep at the bottom. Usually during the day, you're not going to have mice inside there. You hope not, unless you got other problems in a really weak hive. But it's going to be that time, and it's probably going to turn, in a matter of a few days. You know how Kansas is. So, but for this week, it looks pretty good through the weekend. So, like Robert says, maybe by the end of October, we'll be 30-degree drop. Is that the norm?
That's yeah. On average, it's 30 degrees cooler.
Yeah.
And Patrick made a comment. Judy Woosmart encourages beekeepers to leave as much propolis on the hive during the fall. And Matthew and Sandy Brandis are making a comment. Says source Martel AC et al.
Sorry, Robert, I was trying to reply to, I think it was John's first comment about propolis being
Okay.
contaminated with I was trying to edit my comment. Apparently you can't edit it after you put it in there.
No.
I was just trying to find a source, scientific source about, propolis contamination with, chemical treatments and stuff.
And you're mentioning in there that mentions residues of amitraz in wax and honey and propolis.
Yeah.
So amitraz is a pesticide that they came up with in the 1950s on all kinds of things.
Yeah, the Apivar website was claiming that their study showed that there was nothing now, that there was no, they didn't meet the threshold of contamination in honey and wax.
Interesting.
Hmm.
I still wouldn't use it, at least
Oh, I'm with you.
with the honey supers on,
Yeah.
especially.
I think that's kind of going back. I think it's a really good question because it's something I had never thought about, harvesting, because most of the propolis I've collected is just when I'm cleaning up boxes and brood frames and not necessarily out of a propolis trap. But it's definitely something to consider.
Some colonies propolize Apigard a lot worse than other colonies. And I always like to make note of those because then those are the colonies that you could put a propolis trap on in the spring.
Yeah, I just had to pry one of those little wax paper pads off of, 3 frames today doing an inspection. And they had that thing glued down hard.
So if you wanted to try, if you wanted to harvest some propolis, I'd probably make note of which ones were your heavy propolizers and put them on those.
I just finished emailing the B squad, so hopefully we'll have an answer for next month.
Would you
Yeah, Mike,
email
and
them?
if you do get an answer, post it into the Facebook group or something, if you're part of the Facebook group as well. I'm curious to see. And I'll keep doing some studies or some searches on studies. I was in Google Scholar, but I didn't find anything quickly.
Okay, great. So Beth Hull has a question. Should you use solid or screen bottom boards during the winter here?
Them's fighting words.
They are. I depend,
My first answer was yes. Yes, you should use.
Yes, solid and screened, or yes, screened and solid, or solid.
You should use one of the other. You should use yes, screened or
use the
solid.
bottom board.
Great answer. That's a great answer, Becky.
If they're out in the middle of a field, definitely is solid. If they're, protected, it's your choice. Okay.
So as a roundabout way of answering, do you want to just have someone talk about kind of the benefits of each one? I think ultimately it comes down to beekeeper choice, but I think one of the arguments for screened bottom boards is it allows mites to drop through, and it also, depending upon your stance on ventilation, it allows some ventilation too. So you might, discuss what are the pros and cons of both.
Well, I think the cons are, I know when Dewey was here, and I've seen it. I think Randy Oliver is saying too that go back to solid bottom boards because the screens don't work like they were supposed to. That's my recollection, and that's what you'll find if you go out and look at it. But when they were coming and doing presentations at our meetings, that was a switch around. That's what they were promoting a couple of years ago. I was going back to solids, and I've gone back to solids. I used them for a decade. In my case, I just think they pushed the nest up further going into the fall and the winter than I wanted them to. I want them to start down lower in the bottom brood box. Anybody else?
We saw a lot of propolizing the screen on ones that were left open, which is kind of the sign that the bees weren't particularly thrilled with having that big drafty space. So I think that if you have some way to block it a little, put a piece of board, slide it in or something to kind of eliminate a little bit of that, probably is a better plan here. If you lived further south, it probably matters even less, but that we saw a lot of propolizing of those screens.
Well, the bees naturally, normally you find them in trees and stuff, and they don't have usually a bottom opening like that big to let all that air in. And out here in western Kansas, I don't know of too many out here that use screen bottoms.
Exactly. All that wind.
Yeah. Except today we didn't have any wind.
Yeah, no. That's what made it warm up. I think when I talked to my mother at 5:30, she had said it was 73 where they were in Miami County, and I was up in Parkville, Missouri. It was 80.
Yeah, it was 84 here around 4 o'clock.
I'll take it for October. Okay. And someone said they apologize for joining late, and if it's already been discussed, but they wanted to know that they had purchased ApiGuard and wants to know if they can put it on now. I would just say, just talking about treatments in general, it's so important to read the labels and get the instructions. It will tell you it's temperature sensitive and not to put it on when it's too hot. I used it for a long time, but I haven't used it in several years. 80 is a good temperature, but if it gets to the 90s or a low 90s, upper 80s, it's probably too warm. I know Cheryl uses it a lot. What's your experience, Cheryl?
Yeah, I mean, I have no problem with it in the 80s. I have had sometimes to use it in higher temperatures. You'll have them sometimes tear out brood if you apply it when we have too hot of temperatures and the high humidity. You want to not have, you know, an entrance reducer in place. If you have to, I mean, if it's second application, we're going to have some really hot weather. If you try not to put that, you know, for the first couple days that you put the application on, if it can be, you know, overcast, cooler and rainy for that first couple days you put it on. Otherwise, you'll chase a bunch of them out. And like I said, they'll start tearing brood open. They even have the recommendation of doing a half dose and maybe doing 3 applications, but you have to read your insert. I have never done the half strength. I've done the full 50 gram or whatever twice, 2 different applications. So. The other issue is you're kind of getting treatment on late. So, I mean, if this is your first treatment for mites, October is getting late. I mean, it's good to get it on. Go ahead and get it on because they need it, but.
Great, thank you. Let's see. Marsha Harmon says she's got a few wasps that are snacking on her bees, and they can catch, I guess on any bee they can catch in front of the hive. Entrances are reduced. I'm assuming this is just normal natural behavior. Usually I've seen them pick up dead bees, but I've never seen them take live bees.
Are they assassin flies? Are you confusing wasp with an assassin fly? An assassin fly will pick them off.
Well, I guess I need to look up assassin fly. I don't think I know that creature.
Assassin fly while we're online here.
Okay, I will.
They're a predator. They'll eat bees. I've had praying mantis outside hives eating bees this time of year. Your pretty field spider, orb spider, will put nest webbing right across the fronts and catch them. There's been some wasps around mine and yellow jackets, and they're just looking for food. They're wanting to get in the hive, but usually your guard bees, they'll gang up on one of those pretty quick and in defense, especially if you got your reducers on so that they can.
Yeah, not assassin fly. These look like, I mean, I didn't do any more Google searching, but these look like the little wasps that I had, the ground wasps last year. And there's only 2 of them. So it's not like this is a huge deal, and they also had a couple of new bees. They had a lot of fuzz on their back. So I don't know how they got them. Maybe they were just on the ground and they happened to attack them, but it's 2. It's not, this isn't like a major thing. I just thought, oh, that's interesting. The 2 wasps are hanging around on the ground in front of one of the hives, and they always have 1 bee.
Look for nests underneath your, I had a huge wasp nest under one of my hives when I was taking treatments off a couple weeks ago, and I had to go back in the evening to take care of the wasp nests that are under mine.
Okay, I'll look, but I haven't, last year I know I had one that was quite nearby. This year I haven't seen one. I just see those 2 very threaded. They're tiny little wasps.
Yeah.
And they're snacking on a bee.
Huh.
I'll get a photo if I can. I'll post it for you.
Yeah, post a photo. I mean, because the wasps and stuff, they're just looking for a way to get in and get food. And
Yeah, they're not getting in.
Yes.
But don't they want protein? So that's why they're eating the bees?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's what someone told me.
There's a great article in Bee Culture that came out, I think Friday, and I posted it. There's a link in the chat comment to the bottom. But if you get the email, that you can get that also from there, and maybe they'll have it in print, hopefully, because I get so many calls in July and August, September, especially now, and also in October about I've got bees and I have a problem. They're stinging me, and I'm like, I don't
Yellow
think they're
jackets.
bees. Send me a picture.
Yellow jackets.
And the
Lots
yellow
of them.
jackets.
Yeah, I've had 2 calls of that today already.
Yeah. So you too.
Yeah. Cheryl,
Yes.
when you're talking about the assassin fly, is that the same as the robber fly?
Yeah.
Okay, because I know it as the robber fly.
They
It's
look like a dragonfly without the wing.
Yeah. Exactly. Okay, that's the same. Okay. Yeah, they'll take bees occasionally.
I have them all over the place this year.
Yeah.
They're just a natural predator.
But yeah, your yellow jackets are mainly, I think, I don't think a yellow jacket will take on a live bee. I don't know if they will or not, but I know they are working on feeding on the dead ones that are around the outside and stuff. I know that. And this time of year, yellow jackets are really bad. So.
Thank you. Had one question here, and I'll answer it because it's going to be brief. Is it too late to put a honey super on and frames are not drawn out in the honey super? Yes, it's that time of year we take honey supers off and put them away until spring, until April or May. So take them off, and it's too late to put them on. Your population is going down, not up. And feel free to ask if you need any more details. And Marcia Harmon's asking again, if the mites drop through the screened bottom board, how long does the mite live? Couldn't it just jump on board on another bee before the mite dies? Who would like to tackle that? Jim Morford, what do you say? You just joined us, so I see you.
Yeah.
The question was,
Again, Robert.
if the mites drop through the screen onto the bottom board, how long does it live? And could it just jump on board on another bee before it dies?
Well, when we use screen boards, we never had any trouble. When they went through, they don't climb back up. Of course, we had them elevated about 12 to 15 inches, but we're, of course, we're done with bees now because we're relying on our son to keep us up with bees. But yeah, I don't think they'll climb back up. If they've got enough distance, they got to come back up. But in our case, we didn't have anything below the screen.
And they won't live more than a few days without a host.
Will you guys remember when Jerry Hayes came to the Kansas honey producers meeting and he said someone had done a mite check and they brought the mite sample into his office, and it was like several feet from him, and pretty soon he had mites crawling up his legs. So
I'd
that
run.
kind of sticks in my mind that maybe screen bottom boards aren't all they seem to be. So anyway,
They were hungry.
they were looking for something. They were on the move.
When I use the screen bottom boards, I always put either a sticky surface or oil or a powder that would interfere with the mites. And then I finally just quit using the open bottom boards like that. I just went back to solids. I found it much easier to clean the bottom board, and keep track of it and see what I was doing. So if you are going to use the screen bottom board, you want to put some other barrier or whatever that slows or captures the mites so they don't go back up.
Rick needs to check his hives to see if he still has small hive beetles, because as dry as it's been, that should have really cut him down. Oops, sorry about that.
All right, thank you.
As in up in Northeast area, if you guys had a lot of trouble with small hive beetles this year, I think down here, Rick was inundated with them this year. Never had problems before, and interestingly enough, I was just saying to Wanda, I think we need to have him make sure he's checked for what they're doing now, because it's been so dry here for better than 2 months that you would think, at least, and Jim Kelly mentioned this somewhere sometime recently, that and we found that up when we were out there at our farm, that the drought and as dry the conditions generally are, that really seemed to curtail the use of the existence of small hive beetles. We never, in 20 years, we never had trouble with small hive beetles.
Yes, we do have them, and we do have problems. And they do take advantage of weak hives. I haven't seen as much damage this summer as I have in years past, but I've read a lot about them. So, anybody else have issues?
I have questions if we want to take a small hive beetle sidebar.
Sure, we're on the topic.
So the way the small hive beetle reproduces, right, is it would potentially lay an egg in the honeycomb or in the wax or whatever, and the larvae fall out, I understand, and then they fall off onto the ground, and then they pupate in the soil, correct?
Kind of. They lay lots of eggs, and they're after the protein. If they can get into the pollen, that's what they want to eat, and then they grow, and then yes,
Right.
When they're ready,
So,
they pupate and drop
right.
out to the ground and then pupate.
Obviously, if you have pupating or if you have larvae in your hive, that's a pretty bad infestation at that point, I would imagine. So I'm just wondering, I guess my question is, we see a lot of hive. I mean, I saw some hive beetles this year. I mean, 10 or 15 in a hive, but I have to imagine that those are flying in and not reproducing on the ground outside in front of my hive, because I've never, I don't allow the hives to get that far along with an infestation.
Correct.
So obviously they're reproducing elsewhere and then just, zoning in on the hive and coming in that way.
Right. So if they're not inundated with the beetles and the beetles can't get in and into the pollen, the bees, what they're doing is they're corralling them in the upper parts of the hive or away from the brood nest area, and they're feeding them actually nectar or honey. Or they might be in areas where they can get nectar or honey in open comb, but that doesn't trigger them to lay eggs from what I've learned. What triggers them to lay eggs is when they can get into the pollen, because pollen is the protein. Anybody else? So although you might see beetles at the top of your beehive, that doesn't mean that your colony is going to be doomed. It just means that's where they've been keeping the bees. And when we open the lid, take the lid off, open the hive, we give them an opportunity to escape. They don't like the light, and the bees had them corralled, and then the corral's broken, and so then they're scattering.
So I had a pollen patty on my first year and pulled it out, and it was absolutely loaded with the small hive beetle larva, and I haven't used a pollen patty since.
Because that's protein. Yeah.
Yeah.
Two of the things I've noticed is it seems like full sun hives are not affected as much. I haven't really noticed if it's the population, or if it is actually the sun. The other thing is try not to have a lot of open comb.
Yeah, correct on both of those. Any other comments on small hive beetles? They're interesting that they're here with us, so learn about
So I
them.
see Tyler made a comment that he said he's been, or is it Travis made a comment that he's battling small hive beetle? Yeah, Travis Morgan. I'm curious, Travis, I mean, when you say you're battling, I mean, are you seeing 15, 20, hundreds? How are you battling? I'd just be curious to clarify that.
We're using multiple types of traps. We're using oil traps. We're using traps that have diatomaceous earth in them called beetle barns. And then we also have an entrance reducer on there called a guardian that keeps them from being able to get in, and we've sealed the hive up. So we've just been trying everything.
So do you have a really high number of small hive beetles? Is that the problem?
Yes, the oil traps, we pulled them, and we've had one time out of one hive pulled hundreds out.
I mean,
How
they
you're-
even had that fuzzy stuff on the on their bottom boards, you know, how they get when small hive beetle are really bad that looks like cottony stuff.
Are your colonies in shade or sun or both, or?
Heavy shade.
Yeah. That's where the recommendation is, if you're able to keep them in the sun.
So Robert, okay, I bit my tongue when that first came up. So I'm gonna ask a question though. I've always heard that full sun is important for hives because it keeps the beetle from reproducing, right? Because the larva has to fall off the bottom board, and then it has, it goes into the ground, and it, where it pupates. And so I always was under the assumption that full sun was to keep the earth and around the hive dry. But if they're not even to the point where they're pupating, full sun will only tell me that it's the heat that's keeping them at bay, not keeping them from reproducing.
Yeah, it's the dryness. So they need, from the books that I've read, they like high humidity. They need high humidity to reproduce. And having colonies in the sun keeps them drier than colonies that are in the shade.
Oh, inside the hive, the humidity in the hive.
In and outside, yeah.
Okay, that's good. I had
It-
not heard that.
It won't totally
Small
eliminate
hive
it.
beetles can fly 175 feet or better, so you're never going to stop them. But yeah, it's recommended that your hives be in the sun, and
Well-
primarily that, you know, and of course when you have you know, bees that hover on the outside of the hive because you have high humidity, that's the time. But I've never had a problem that bees couldn't control as long as the hive was strong. When you have weak hives is when you really have to watch out in terms of small hive beetles becoming a problem where they really damage the hive.
Exactly, because they can get to the protein, they can get to the pollen. Most of the pollen is stored in the brood nest area, and they will eat brood too, not just, and that's protein to them. So if a colony gets weak and they get to the brood, that's when they can take them down by laying the eggs. And they lay, Dr. Young Park, who spoke at our KHPA meeting 4 or 5 years ago, you know, has them in his office, and he determined that they laid about 230, 40 eggs. The male beetles actually come in and they will eat some of those eggs up. So, you know, but there's still, like, you may have 180 of those little worms that hatch from one female. But they need moisture and high humidity.
If you want to do some research, Dr. Jamie Ellis has done a lot of small hive beetle research.
And thank goodness we get a break up here where we live. Geographically, we live in a good part of the country where we get a winter. We're not in Florida where they don't get a break.
So does diatomaceous earth or something like that help? If should we put that down over the winter? Is that a deterrent, or does that help keep them from doing what they do?
No, because they fly, and the diatomaceous earth is only to help kill the pupa, the worms that come out and go into the ground.
So if you were going
Larvae.
to do it, you would do those in this, you would do diatomaceous earth in the summer if you were going to use it.
But if you did diatomaceous earth, you're already too late. All you're doing is preventing them from maturing. But those worms have already done the damage to your comb and the bees inside the colony, because something happened to your bees and they got too weak.
Okay.
Robert, I understood
Yeah.
that diatomaceous earth would kill the beetles, that's why they were putting diatomaceous earth in the traps.
Yeah, it could do that too.
Yeah, so if you sprinkle diatomaceous earth directly under your hive, you might kill a few bugs. I just don't feel like that's a very efficient way of
Right.
dealing with it. But I mean,
Because
yeah.
Because by the time
It absorbs moisture. You have to keep reapplying it every time you get a rain. I mean, I used Freeman traps when I had problems with the hives. Mine were in full sun. Mine were down by the lake. And I don't know if it's the soil conditions and moisture down there, but I had some issues a few years with hive beetle. And I put Freeman traps under all of mine. And instead of using oil in the tray, I used Dawn dishwashing soap and water. Enough that the beetle would, when the small hive beetle fell, they would fall into the water and not be able to climb out, just like you'd add Dawn soap to your sink at night to take care of the vinegar flea or the gnats. You know, they fall through. I was using about half a teaspoon to a gallon of water and put those in the bottom. I've tried diatomaceous earth, I've tried lime, that sort of thing. It all absorbs moisture over time, and then it gets a hard crusty surface on it, and then it has no effect at all when the beetles fall through into the tray. So I mean, you either need to use the oil or you could try the soapy water. It does add some moisture to it, obviously. this time of year. I mean, like Robert said, keep a strong hive and make sure you've got enough bees, bee population, you know, in comparison to the comb. So if you had a swarm episode or something in the summer months, sometimes you may have to reduce your colony by an entire box because they don't have enough bees to protect the space. And you don't want them to get a foothold in. But
Yeah, and you're going to see a lot of, I mean, you'll see a lot of adult beetles from now until next spring. And what
Right.
they're trying to do is survive and overwinter. So we don't have a breeding problem where
right.
they're going to get in and take over with the larva and kill the colony until next spring, till April or May. So they're done breeding and making the, you know, those messy problems by this time of year.
Hey, Travis, since you seem to be using lots of different methods to try to control your problem, what have you, just anecdotally, what do you feel like has been the most effective? And you're on mute if you're trying to talk.
Yeah, I'm trying to post a picture because I've got a picture here of some traps. There's some oil traps that have oil in two sides, and then you put cider vinegar in the middle.
Yeah,
That seems to be the most effective.
because they're the vinegar attracts them.
Yeah, the vinegar attracts them, but they can't get into the compartment where the vinegar is, and then they go into the oil side and they drown.
I was just having that conversation the other day with someone. I don't remember if it was with you, Robert, or Cheryl, about, you know, having an attract, or maybe it was Becky, even having an attractant in the small hive beetle traps. Because I think a lot of people just put oil in there
You
and
can
rely
you
and
can
just rely upon the bees to push the beetles in there. But if there's no attract, you know, I think that trap that you're referring to, I've read about. So that's interesting.
Well, we may have more questions than we can get to tonight. We're almost at the top of the hour. A quick one from Leo Hanos. He's asking, I have an unused shed. Would you consider putting a hive inside a shed for the winter protection? And one side of that shed is open. Personally, I wouldn't do it. I don't know where you are, and you know, if you're out in the open or if they have a tree line, I wouldn't put my bees in. It sounds like something more for the cows.
Well, and the bees only keep warm in the hive right in the cluster, so it really wouldn't serve any purpose in our part of the country. It creates a windbreak, but that would really be about all.
Mm-hmm. Let's see, the next one is Novus, first year, 2 hives, both healthy. Trying to get through it because it's a lot of details here. Both relatively healthy, heading into winter with both having 2 deep hive boxes full of brood food, etc. Pulled off all supers prior to treatment. Good, sounds good so far. Have a ton of soybeans. They may not get much from the soybeans. I've got asters near the hives. How often, what quantity, and what months do I need to do to feed 2-to-1 sugar syrup? I guess it's a question about when you should feed and at what ratio. 2-to-1 is the winter feed. If they're heavy, you don't need to feed. That's my opinion. Anybody else?
Yeah, if you got two deeps full of honey, you wouldn't need to feed.
Right. Yeah. So these aren't, I mean, these are livestock, but it's not typical for us to have to feed your bees through the winter, only if they're desperate and they need it. And they may not be. I mean, believe it or not, we haven't had an extreme drought in many years, 5, I believe, so far. So usually if we're in a drought situation, they're not going to get enough to make it through in the fall or late summer, but they've got lots of pollen. That's their protein. They should have lots of stored honey. That's the carbohydrate. So I don't feed all my bees every year.
We'll have, I'm working on the newsletter. I'll hope to have that out by the end of this week. We're gonna discuss feeding again. So, check out the newsletter as well.
And we did have last month's monthly meeting on feeding that Becky presented. So we will have that video up as a YouTube link here probably in the next 3 or 4 days.
Are you saying the meeting, you're going to decide on whether it's live or not? Or it will be live this month?
It's been live the last 2 months, and it
And
should
it's
be
still gonna
live this month.
this month.
Okay,
Yeah. We're doing live meetings with the hybrid Zoom as well. So I think we have the technical situation worked out. So it should go
Talking
smoother.
about feeding though at the last meeting, and since it gets recorded, and it takes Robert a little bit to get it cleaned up and ready, you can access it on the club's website and watch it if you missed the meeting last month on feeding.
Great. Well, it has been an hour. There are more questions than we can get to. I think we've gotten to quite a few of them. So some of them are comments, but at any rate, thank you everyone for joining. We appreciate you coming in on a warm fall day. The nice thing is it's dark out now. So anyway, great to see your faces and hear your voices.
The third Thursday value added talk for KHPA is Robin Coulterman talking about liquid soap. And the Kansas honey producers are meeting in person November 5th and 6th in Salina. And our guest speakers are Cameron Jack and Randall Cass. Randall is the extension entomologist at Iowa State. So I think we'll have a really good program plan. So
Check out your buzzer, because we'll have lots of information about that meeting in the buzzer. So be sure you look at it, and hope you guys will, if you can't come to the meetings in person, do the Zoom. It's working real well.
Hey, Jolie, Becky, will the KHPA conference also be via Zoom? Or is that just going to be an in-person?
Great question.
I hope it's just going to be in person.
I think
Okay.
in person.
Very good.
So,
Thanks, everybody. Night.
see you in 2 weeks. 2 weeks from tonight is the monthly meeting. So thank you. See you
We'll
then.
see ya.